Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Narad, and Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, Ravina.
To all of you.
Thank you.
We are happy to continue today Evenings with Sraddhalu, our last series for this year. And today, part 185, and we continue on the current affairs. Today, we will be focusing on how the revolutions were engineered, and we will be answering some questions. And as usually, you may send your questions beforehand to our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. I have a comment that we got from Rajesh. It was not during 1989's tenure of Rajiv Gandhi that the Pope visited India and said so as you told. It was during Vajpayee's time of 2000-2001 that Pope visited and said so as you are telling. Please check and verify.
Okay. So there were a few questions from our discussion last time, and I thought it useful to touch upon those before we move to the theme for today. And Rajesh's comment that it was not 89, it was in 2000. Actually, I was remembering the year vaguely. It was 1986. What I was referring to was the Pope was invited in 1986 when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, and his wife Sonia Gandhi was a hardcore Christian with openly declared intentions to participate in the full conversion of India to Christianity. And it was under her pressure that Rajiv Gandhi invited the Pope. And at that time, it is on record, the video, I think, of his speech, also the text of his speech is on record. You will find it. It was in a stadium in Delhi, where he called for the full conversion of Asia under the Catholic Church. So that's a correction on the date, not 89, but 86, but under Rajiv Gandhi's rule. We can look at the next question.
Under the nickname Non-Zero Span, we got a question. I wonder how you have understood Judeo-Christian teachings. The Bible is not meant to be taken literally, nor would any proper student or practitioner convey it in the way you have. It is very much like the Upanishads and the Vedas, using teaching stories with metaphorical methods. Most religions are set out to banish ignorance, even if some of their practitioners get lost in self-absorption and narcissism and use the religion as a weapon for their own selfish means. And then, as we have seen, it gets distorted from the original message, and much violence and destruction takes place. Looking at the justice and the mercy dynamic in Judeo-Christian systems, one can see a correspondence to the law of karma. The idea of hell is the same as reaping what you sow in terms of what your actions are. The explanations of karma has some perhaps more sophisticated mechanisms, but ultimately, I think they're referring to the similar process.
Mm-hmm. So this was a comment under the comments to the video. Yes, I needed to make one correction in the context. What I was describing last time when I described the broad framework of Christianity, Islam, and compared that with the Dharmic traditions in the East, both in India as well as in China largely, you will find this huge difference between them, that they don't try to proselytize or convert. But these two where I spoke of, and their particularly strong anti-rational approach in the very basic content. So there were some observations that I had made, and Non-Zero Spin is commenting on that, saying that you have not quite got the point of the Bible teaching. So I want to clarify, what I was criticizing was not the Bible as such or the text in the Bible, but the overall core belief promoted by the church, which is without which Christianity is not Christianity. You see, you can drop large chunks of the Bible it would still remain Christianity. But the core of Christianity, which according to the church itself is this whole narrative about Adam and Eve being tempted by the serpent, committing a sin by going against God's explicit orders not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Then as a result, they are thrown out of paradise and on earth. It's this narrative which then concludes with God sends His only Son on earth to take away the sins of humanity, because now logically, according to them, or according to that religious logic, all human beings descending from Adam and Eve are therefore full of sin. And you've done nothing wrong. The fact that you're born is good enough that you're participating in the sin that Eve had. And this had, of course, a huge effect on in Europe and the church on putting all women as the cause of sin. So if you think like that, you're brainwashed to think from childhood that you're born and there's this sin caused by Eve and you're somehow, as a result, condemned to be on earth. And then God sends His only chosen Son, who now has to suffer, and the more He suffers, the more He's taken away your sin. And only through Him you can now get free of that sin and eventually get to paradise after you die, of course. So the entire fiction which is made up, this is what I'm pointing to as the fiction, is unverifiable, illogical, and the points I was making about the failure of logic on that. And the moment you have this as the basis, you throw this out and there is no church, there is no Christianity. Bible can be there, but without this, it's not Christianity. You understand? So the point I was making was this core belief system, which is promoted, that as a result of which you have to repent and get salvation through Christ, is fiction which is unverifiable and irrational. And as a result, you're required to be irrational to be able to accept something so fundamentally irrational. On the other hand, if you read the Bible, and the Bible predates Christianity for the large part of it, it's just the word itself, the name is Biblios, which Bible is library of various books at that time considered to be worthy of putting together as a library. And they're full of symbolic narrations, moral stories, and then a little bit of mysticism, etc. And you can take those quite independent of the church teaching or even of Christ. You don't need church teaching or Christ to look at the Bible and appreciate for these content. So I'm separating the two things, and my primary objective was to criticize the framework of the church belief system, which is behind the whole conversion agenda. If Bible was merely presented as a book with useful moral, ethical, and mystical narrations and content, it would be one of the many helpful textbooks for those who are in that tradition. But that's not the way it is promoted. It is rather the support vehicle for the church teaching, which involves now a mass global conversion agenda, which is done with the sophistication and planning of exactly the same goals of regime change, overthrowing governments, brainwashing people to bring them under subjugation of their multinational global ownership program, basically. There is something which is called there's a dedicated website which is called the Joshua Project, I believe, in which every single house in India is listed. Every city, every street, every house number is marked for whether they have been converted to Christianity, whether they have been approached for conversion, and whether they have refused. I think it's called the Joshua Project. Now this is a massive organization. This is not done casually. I go back and look at data. I didn't want to get too much into this detail last time. I look at data of the 1970s, 80s and 90s, where the church has done surveys in various villages, in the most far out villages that even your television had not reached at that point, to look at what were the driving motives, financial compulsions, weak points, social weak points of various groups, categorize them, and then developed a strategy for conversion of these groups. And once it got to the point where they had their own chief ministers and chiefs of political chiefs, then the program became organized with state support. So for example, in Andhra Pradesh, when this was done, when the chief minister became Christian and declared himself as a Christian, it was not national interest, it was Christian interest for conversion, which he activated, and then started a whole program of diverting government funds to fund people to go to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. It was a pattern which the previous government under Nehru and Indira Gandhi, continuing that, had already started for the Hajj pilgrimage, where the government funds would be given to Hajj pilgrims to go to Saudi Arabia. And where did the funds come? I'll give an example of this. In Karnataka at that time, now these are statistics maybe now 15 years old. In Karnataka, from the Hindu temples, which were all controlled by the government, which still are to this day in India, the bulk of the temples are controlled by the government, state governments. They take away all the money that the Hindus donate to the temples. So in Karnataka, they would take away 80 crores at that time. And a crore is 10 million rupees. So 800 million rupees would be taken away by the state government, of which 20 crores would be used for funding the Hajj pilgrimage of Muslims in order to get the Muslim vote. And 5 crores would go back to the temples to maintain the daily prayers and pujas, without which the money would stop coming. You can see the proportion of usage. And the balance, this 25 used up, the balance of 55 crores would be going to so-called public funds. That means the state would run on it. So if it was effectively a state taxation, not just in Karnataka, the statistics are from Karnataka, this was in every state of India, is still so in every state of India, that the state is effectively taxing the Hindu faith to fund junkets for other religions, to promote them, to make them more committed to their religious practices, as well as in Tamil Nadu, lands belonging to Hindu temples were taken away by the government and gifted to churches for conversion programs and opening institutions. And this is continuing even now. It's blatant, it's open. Nobody talks about it because any politician who talks about it will not get the Muslim vote or the Christian vote, and they can't risk it. Nobody dares to touch it to this day, even under the Modi government. So you understand how this works. Of course, Modi government will say we're a central government, each state has its own freedom, but none of the BJP ruled states also dares to make this change, which is what? Freeing Hindu temples so that the Hindu funds come back either to promote the Hindu teaching or at least sustain Hindu society. The churches and the money is going to churches and mosques go to promote their religion and their society and their education, etc. But only Hindu funds are taken away by the government for everything else and for other religions. So it's effectively a taxation, very similar to what happened under Islamic rule in India, where if you were a Hindu, you had to pay tax or convert or be killed. This was the rule under Mughal rule. So I'm pointing to these things as a serious problem. And we have to understand there is an agenda behind which is so well organized that there is very little that the ordinary people can do. So I'm digressing. The Joshua Project is an example of how well organized it is. And this has nothing to do with the Bible. So yes, my comment to non-zero spin, yes, I was not commenting on the Bible. Yes, you can accept the Bible as a helpful book with metaphorical teachings and so on. But in no way can you compare with Upanishads and Vedas. They are not merely stories. They also use stories. They are direct transcriptions of experiences. You do find that in the Bible, but very superficially touching upon certain indicative experiences, but there's nothing in comparison to the Upanishads and the Veda, and this analogy you've made does not quite apply. The Upanishads do use metaphorical methods also, but they go straight to the philosophical content and describe the nature of reality in philosophical terms, which is much higher in terms of intellectual content than the story narration or mere morality and ethics, which you will find generally in the biblical stories. Now, I have seen certain passages of the Bible which are very obtuse, very difficult to understand, being interpreted on a mystical and even a astrological level, and then you find, oh, that makes sense, which to me suggests that there is a prior tradition of which what you have today as the Bible is a largely mistranslated remnant And in that prior tradition, perhaps these things were more alive. As you see in Judaism today, there is the more orthodox Judaism, and then there is the mystical content of Judaism, which actually looks at some of these truths. I want to make another observation also to Non-Zero Spin's comment, that when he says that in the Judeo-Christian systems you can see a correspondence to the law of karma. Yes, you will see a correspondence to everything which is true, which is real, because it's real and true. But a correspondence is not an explicit statement. So I had once in Egypt, we were in a meeting where this group, which were very devoted people, they quoted from the Quran something about appreciating the value of trees or something like that. And then I said, see, therefore, the Quran and Islam promotes ecology. No, not quite. That's an exaggeration. It was just an appreciation. Oh, yes, the trees gives you fruit. That's it. But you don't say that's ecology. So in the same way, just because you see correspondences of law of cause and effect, as you sow, so shall you reap. It's not an explicit formulation of the principle of karma. And I avoid the word law because from a larger spiritual point of view, it's one of the principles. It's not such a hard set law. And then Non-Zero Spin says the idea of hell is the same as reaping what you sow for what your actions are. No, it's not it. Not at least in the church teaching. I don't know enough about the Bible, but in the church teaching, it's actually a domain where you will go, where you will be punished and tortured for the rest of eternity. It's not just sowing, reaping what you sow. There is, in fact, the mother observes within the church a subgroup that understands that these hells are actually temporary passages, and that's the concept of the purgatory, which also exists. And so it's not an eternal damnation, and you're passing through purgatory where things are purged. And yes, that corresponds to a truth, because in the immediate aftermath of leaving the body in what we call death, you go through this phase where you continue to relive your fancies and fears and imaginations until those break down and are purged, so to say. But that's a different story, and it certainly does not fit the way Non-Zero Spin describes it here. And he says explanation of karma has some similar, more sophisticated mechanism, but ultimately they're referring to a similar process. No, not quite. There is a huge difference. Otherwise, if you take a similarity as evidence of sameness, then you end with the New Age type of confusion where everything is the same. Just because you can find a tiny bit that corresponds to something else, it's all the same. No, it's not. And we should be able to distinguish and recognize things for what they are. The Upanishad is of a very high order of both intellectual as well as spiritual content. In comparison, the Bible at best would come close to what we could call in the Indian traditions the stories which come, the name slips my mind, but in the stories which are narrated, which are derived sometimes from Vedic and Upanishadic origins, in the Puranic stories, that was the word I was looking for. So closer to the Puranic type, but even in there, the Puranic stories have very deep spiritual messaging, even in their narration. Whereas the Bible is largely moralistic and ethical. It's not really spiritual principles which are promoted, but moral and ethical values. Just look at the 10 Commandments. They're primarily moral behavior patterns, to each of which you could find very easily situations where those commandments break down. So they're not even going to a deeper spiritual level as such. So they represent something which the society at that stage found helpful or was necessary for the society to make one step of morality or ethical progress. But as such, it does not have real depth of spirituality. I think we can go to the next question.
Nitin is writing, I totally resonate with all the content shared by Sraddhalu. It's really helpful. But one thing noticed, his view on China are indeed true to some extent, but they lack truth on some fronts about that topic. I'm saying this because the content available on the internet about China is heavily propagandized by USA, which is defaming and spreading a false image of China. If one wants to really learn about China, Chinese real economic growth, their social, political environment, then first, one should read the content which is provided by the Chinese state-owned media. This can help gain a view on the other side of the coin and hence discriminate the truth and untruth. There is a real crunch of information on life inside China because of the Chinese internet firewall and also the independent Chinese ecosystem of operating software and apps, which doesn't allow the mingling of the huge 1.4 billion people with the rest of the internet land. Second, one can also see content posted on YouTube by Westerners living since some years in China and who can tell the real difference in the overall life in Western countries versus China. Third, one can personally visit China and live there to gain a first-hand experience of it. Fourth, or read some blogs and articles which specifically go in depth to show how the US is different from China, how life in China really is, what exactly is the Chinese political system.
Yes, and he gives some links for looking at those. I had a look at some of those links also. But yes, you're right, Nitin, when you say that one has to look at the other side. And this is what I've been advocating. You do not know somebody's a situation unless you've actually looked at both sides. And yes, you should look at Chinese state-owned media also. But then once you look at it, not superficially, but with some depth, you realize there is a huge, massive amount of state suppression of events and viewpoints. So, for example, if you look at Tiananmen Square and the massacre that took place, and it was a government-ordered massacre of young people, you post something which mentions Tiananmen Square, and instantly you have a group of people who's monitoring the internet all the time, who step in and remove. Now, that level of censorship itself to me is very disturbing. So state-controlled media will certainly show you the positive aspects, and I agree there's a huge achievement of economic progress in China going back, let's say, the last 30 years. From the point China, so to say, set aside its communism and brought a mix of capitalism with communism. But the statism, the domination of the state, which you saw in the USSR, that is very strong even with capitalism. To this extent that you are actually not allowed to think or speak certain things which the state considers threatening. Now, once that is in place, who will control the controllers? This becomes the big problem. And yes, I agree that there's a difference in lifestyle. Yes, there's a massive progress economically, but with that have come other problems, huge problems, psychological problems, suicidal tendencies, and so on. The young people are frustrated, not having a direction and sense of purpose in life. I've met with some of these people who are youngsters, and they're very deeply disturbed. They don't find a way. They turn to spirituality, at which point China found that it was helpful to allow Buddhism, but the Chinese controlled Buddhism, and so on. But the nature of the control is such that, for example, if you look at the Uyghur Muslims, the fact that they had an Islam which refused to accept the state control meant now the state had to impose itself, put them into slave training camps, and so on. This part state media will never tell you. This part will come only from the other side. So yes, I agree with the positive aspects of economic development, but to me the fact that the mind is held in a box is not healthy for evolution. You also comment about the Chinese internet firewall, which makes it difficult for outsiders to know what's happening inside. But why is that so? Why won't China boast about its good things? Because a firewall goes both ways. They don't want those who are inside to know what is happening outside, because they fear that it might lead to a revolution. So in the process, the outside cannot know much of what is inside. And so the fact that Chinese firewall is kept so tight and the independent ecosystem is so isolated from the rest of the world is again to me a disturbing sign, because it means a need to have very tight controls on what is permitted as thinking and what is not. And yes, I have actually visited China. I have friends who have lived there, and I have had interactions with friends who actually who are Chinese. And so I do have an understanding and appreciation of the achievements. So my criticism was about this other aspect. This other aspect is what is so dangerous, because if this becomes now the model for the rest of the world, then you will not be allowed to have this discussion which we are having now. And to me, any discussion, even if you disagree, even if you make mistakes, without a free discussion, you will not be able to overcome your mistakes or misunderstandings or grow in any way. And so anything that suppresses freedom, and now to compare, since you've been comparing with the US as it was, let's say, 20 years ago, was very different. As it was 50 years ago, was even more different. Freedom of speech was sacrosanct. In the last 20 years, this has been rapidly degenerating, and the same censorship and cancel culture has been growing, peaking after Trump's election, 2016-17, the censorship of the media by media, not by Trump. That and the control almost attempted to replicate what was in China. And that was when the media also began actually to praise the Chinese model. And some of it, I recall at that point seeing a news item that said the New York Times had received $50 million grant from China. And then you have to wonder why. Obviously, there are certain interests, there are certain compulsions, it changes the nature of the narrative and so on. But look at also the link which I had put up last time, where a Chinese professor describes how they have taken control of the US government and the US markets and so on. So understand that what I was describing was not ignoring the good part of the development and economy of China, but it is this part of the mind control and censorship which would not allow free human progress. And I think we have one more question which we can take up before moving to the theme for today. I think Ritu has said, sometimes I find Hindu Indian people worse than Chinese and Mohammedans. Hindus show perversion of rape and barbarity, cruelty, as in Nirbhaya case. A huge number of such cases exist. And I am not against or in favor of any particular religion. And then she says, when the supramental starts working to see beyond the forms as Mother saw for Orville, no religion, no nation, only true light will become your form, your dress, and it will not be deceived by external forms and appearances. Not quite, not quite. First of all, it's not that under the supramental consciousness there will be no religion or no nation. On the contrary, Sri Aurobindo highlighted the value of each nation and national identity because it has something to give, and he describes something which is a nation's soul. So it's not an obliteration of nationality or a suppression of humanity into one monotone, nor will it involve the loss of religions, because even as some grow into a higher spiritual consciousness, there is a slope of humanity, and the place for religions will always remain. There will always be people following religions, and there will always be those who need it as a incubating space before they can be free enough to be able to rise to a wider, freer spirituality. But what will happen, as the wider spirituality grows and becomes more dominant, all the religions will be forced to open out from their narrow framework and widen into a greater, deeper, mystical content, which is the only future that any religion can have. And if it does not move increasingly towards the mystical, it will degrade and become irrelevant or break down, or people will simply abandon it. So this is just one correction as regards. But her initial observation is that you have seen Hindus having perversions and barbaric cruelty, as in Nirbhaya case. No, you're missing the point. When I was describing the mindset and the ideology which is promoted in extremist Islam or extremist Christianity, You have to understand those two ideologies in their extremist form quote from the religious text to justify the barbarism. So, when, for example, the Jew is killed and butchered in the most ugly way by the Hamas justifies it on the grounds of some text. And based on this text, I have to do this. In India, it was the same thing. Under Mughal rule, when they killed Hindus, it was because you were Hindu, and it was under an injunction which was supposedly from a religious injunction. Whereas what you're criticizing, a Hindu being having perversion, etc., they're human beings. Everywhere you go, human beings will have that. They don't do it in the name of Hinduism. If they commit a crime against someone, it's not done in the name of some sacred text or quoting from it, or by calling God while you're killing another. So you have to understand there's a very big difference. That's why I'm not speaking of the religion as such, but an ideology within the religion which is extremist and which totally distorts. And there is no such thing by definition in the Hindu space or in the Dharmic spaces generally. Because first of all, you do not have one fixed book. And none of the books tells you that the others are wrong or that you have to kill them. In fact, the Hindu tradition is the only tradition in the history of Earth, as it survives, which actively, openly says there are as many approaches to God as there are human beings. Each has his own way to approach God. When you have such a broad framework, you can never say somebody else is wrong in their practice or in their approach. So if you are actually following any teaching which is based in the Dharma, you will never say, I have to convert you to my viewpoint. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's explicitly said that if you follow somebody else's approach, even if you're successful in it, you actually lose. You have to follow your approach, they have to follow their approach. So there's no question of conversion. This whole concept of groupthink, which is common to the Abrahamic religions, where you have all to think the same thing, believe the same thing. That whole concept of groupthink in a box does not exist. Each one thinks in their own way, grows in their own way. So there is no question of conversion, there's no question of killing somebody or suppressing somebody's viewpoints because it's different from yours. This being the strength and even the hope for the future of humanity, it's also a weakness when it comes to the indoctrination attacks from outside by those religions or other state interests, which we discussed last time. When they attack, it is this very openness which is used against the Hindus. I give an example. In the 1980s, one of the maids who was working with us, she said, oh, there was this person, evangelical, who went from house to house, went into each home, looked at the deities that you were worshipping and said, here's one more deity, this will bring you good luck, and put it there. They didn't know that it was the icon promoted from the church. Except a few months down, another evangelical came and went into their house and said, why is it this precious one you're keeping? All the others are bad. You should remove them. Only keep this. Because those ones will stop the effect, the good effect of this one. And that's how they began to promote conversion. So the very openness of the gullible Hindu says, all right, I don't mind worshipping any form of God because they're all aspects of the same one divine. Here, add one more little icon. No problem. Next comes this conversion agenda of narrowing and pushing you into the groupthink of a box. So these are dangers, active dangers, and it's possible that this kind of ease of conversion is done when we don't think. And that's why you will see the entry of the church or the Islamic extremism is most in those areas where there is no strong culture of thinking. Whereas those who already think, they very quickly see through the game and it does not work. So my criticism was specifically against the ideological form, and it's not about which religion you belong to. It actually does not matter. You look at a person for what they are, irrespective of what their religion or ancestral religion is, it makes no difference. It's the ideology and the wideness of the mind and the turn of evolutionary growth which matters, nothing else. I would even go so far as to say, if you really looked at your own history, and I mean the true history of your spiritual lineage, not your biological lineage, you'll look back and see that your soul perhaps incarnated in many different religious spaces. Which is yours? None. It's the spiritual turn which is your soul's aspiration. The religious framework was only a container and incubator to assist that. And to that extent, they are helpful and useful. Beyond that, they become an impediment to evolution. I think we can just take the next question. It brings us to our topic.
Yes. Krishna, it's interesting to see how the world theater shifted from Ukraine to Israel almost a month after Zelensky visited Canada and addressed their parliament. This whole debacle, in parentheses, of honoring a Nazi in the Canadian parliament seems deliberate and carefully planned to shift focus. I don't know if this was because the war in Ukraine was losing support, justification amongst US policy makers internally. Nevertheless, any foreign war keeps State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock happy, rich, as they are heavily invested in defense manufacturers.
Okay. Yes. So this is a very important question, and it's going to bring us to the theme for today. But I was just looking at the chat box, and there was an observation by someone called Castidi saying that yamas and niyamas of yoga and virtues in Buddhism and Bible commandments are not wholly dissimilar. They don't correspond one to one, but they strive to deepen spiritual truths revealed by life. No, not quite, again. So what you see in the Bible commandments are purely ethical. They have no spiritual content. You don't steal from your neighbor. It has no spiritual content. Whereas the yamas and niyamas of yoga are not ethical and moral. They are rather practices which are intended to purify you in preparation for the dhyana and samadhi, immersion in the divine consciousness. So the goal you have to see in the context of yama and niyama, it's not like you practice yama and niyama to be a good person. You practice yama and niyama to purify your mind to be able to have a direct experience of the higher truth. So then you stop lying because your mind gets distorted by the lie for this purpose. And it's explicitly stated. Whereas the 10 commandments stop with that, those commandments, you don't tell a lie or you don't steal from your neighbor, because God will be upset and you might get punished later or rewarded depending on what you do. It stops there. There's no spirituality there. It's all about following a rule to be good or bad in the eyes of God. Then that's it. So there's a big difference, and you have to distinguish, not mix it all. Okay, so I think we come to the question now from Krishna. Oh, Janice has said, can you please say Israeli killed and not Jew killed? The reason I said Jew was because the Hamas said that. They did not put on their website, we want to kill every Israeli. They put on their website, we want to kill every Jew. And they link that to a religious order, religious command or belief. So I explicitly stated that. When they go on a killing spree, they don't consider who is a Jew or not. At that point, they are inebriated by their anger or hatred. But the point was, it was very explicit. And you have to understand all this comes from a barbaric mentality. If you give a holy spiritual book to a barbarian, he will still reduce it to his level. End of the day, the problem is there. Even if a book has limitations, a sufficiently refined mind will look at those limitations and automatically discount them or reinterpret on a higher level and move on. But the problem is here of this, that's why I say it's an ideological issue. Okay, so we come to Krishna's question about what has happened in Ukraine and the sudden shift you will see in the policy, in the media focus. If you remember, before Ukraine war started, you had the Black Lives Matter, and you had to show flags in support of Black Lives Matter. And before that, it was something else about the gay pride flag, which was the thing for which you had to cry. Then it became Black Lives Matter. Then instantly it was forgotten, and Ukraine became we stand with Ukraine flag. And then suddenly now you find the Ukraine flag is set aside, and now it is the Palestinian flag, and we stand with Palestine. if you observe the trend, especially when it happens so rapidly and suddenly across the world, then you have to understand, you will recognize that there is a massive media programming at play. Because otherwise you cannot explain why everywhere in the world, suddenly overnight, all these activists come up with the new flag and the new slogan, just like that. And now completely forgetting the old flag. It's not like the problem in Ukraine has ended. The massacre is still continuing. It's not like the Black Lives Matter story has ended. There are still problems in the United States, or if there was something to do with the Gay Pride, those people are still present. So why is it now suddenly we are made to cry for one group having forgotten the other just like that overnight? And meanwhile, through all this last 10 years, the Uyghur Muslims who are being, in the most horrible way, put through extreme suffering. Please look it up for those of you who want. Nobody ever raises a flag about them. Why is it in Pakistan, in the Baloch region, people are being massacred in the hundreds? Even now, nobody raises a flag for them. Why is it that in India, 400,000 people were displaced from Kashmir, thrown out in the most gruesome way, butchered, killed, thrown out of their houses overnight, and became refugees in their own country? Now 30 years have passed. Nobody ever raised a flag for them, not even in India. Why? Because there is no funding for these demonstrations. If you had enough money and you started pumping money to young people saying, raise these flags, speak these slogans, we will give you the money, you will be able to orchestrate such a demonstration for the Kashmiri Pandits, for the Balochis, for the Uyghur Muslims. But nobody is doing that. And so this is where now we begin to think, what's really happening? Who's controlling this? We have the last two times looked at the theme itself we had described as the regime change, colonizing minds, and before that the 100-Year War. And now we merge all this because we are looking at the technology by which the regime change takes place, minds are colonized, or the 100-Year War is implemented. I've been touching upon it. We didn't have enough time the last few times, and I hope today we can do a deeper dive. Here, I want you to look at not just these few cases, but so many more. And you will not understand how important this is unless you get a full scope of what's actually been happening across how many spaces, and the media never informed you of it. So I have put a few links for today's talk. There are, I think, about 10 links in all, and I would like you to look at them later in detail. The first link is a description of the United States toolkit for winning other people's elections. It's actually described as a template for winning other people's elections. It's an article from The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, very highly respected. Nowadays somewhat questionable because it's taken a hard leftist and woke stance. But in 2004, they wrote this article, and I will be quoting from this shortly. The second link I've given is a Wikipedia entry of United States involvement in regime change, which actually describes across the decades where the US government has deliberately intervened to create regime change. And you'll see the numbers are enormous. Then another link is again Wikipedia link, color revolutions, and the list of countries which came under color revolutions, particularly at the end of the Soviet Union when it was disbanded. And then one more, which is a link for Arab Springs, again Wikipedia link, listing all the countries where the Arab Spring revolutions took place. Now, if you look at these 4 links, the scope of these orchestrations of revolutions is so large. It's in fact quite shocking. So just to give an example of the color revolutions, remember this is just what happened when the Soviet Union broke down. There was orchestrated revolution with US funding in most cases. In Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Yugoslavia. In the Arab so-called Spring, again, largely US funded, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain. At the same time, attempted revolutions, which were activated to the level of street demonstrations, but the revolution could not be completed. It failed halfway through, with Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Sudan, and other countries where it was attempted. It rose to minor protests but could not sweep the country in street revolutions. But it was the same toolkit, which is now including Djibouti, Mauritania, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and occupied Western Sahara. That makes for 25 countries in the list. And this is Wikipedia. I frankly don't consider Wikipedia to be complete. It is authoritative because it allows debate, but it is largely woke and suppresses issues which are contrary to the woke ideology. So as far as data is concerned, often it's good, but it's always incomplete. But here, Wikipedia links, nobody can say is controversial, 25 countries listed. And all of them, practically, are largely US influenced. And we're not looking at many others, as in Nicaragua and Mexico and others, where the US has intervened or tried to intervene, as in Cuba and so on. So if you look at the whole list, it is an enormous number, and all in the last 50 years. So when I'm speaking of the US, again, you must understand, when we speak of China, I'm not criticizing the Chinese people or civilization, but the Communist Party. When I'm saying the US, it is not the American people, it's not even sometimes the US presidents who are often puppets. It is the cabal-controlled State Department, mostly, or military, or other military-industrial complex. So the right term would be just the cabal, but we have to understand, since the funding came from the US and was largely orchestrated with US troops and US embassy interventions, we say US. And it was under Trump that all this actually stopped and was even reversed. That was the first time in the last more than 50 years that happened. So by giving you this long list, I want you to recognize that it is not something casual that happens once in a while here or there. This list is from Wikipedia. It does not include, for example, Pakistan, does not include Iran, does not include Iraq, does not include many other African countries, does not include attempted regime changes in India or in Bangladesh or in Myanmar or Sri Lanka. So because some of these have been, so to say, under the radar of the publicity, or it's just Wikipedia, it's based on people's contributions, nobody realizes that it was openly US supported. Because also the United States has become much more circumspect in its toolkit interventions. They have a toolkit, they apply it, but now doing it through second or third layer financiers. Then you can't blame the US government for it, as it was openly done in these lists at least. So we're going to look at certain things which are common to all these revolutions, particularly the recent ones. The use of the internet to communicate between those who were revolutionaries. The social media to organize group actions, which can be now easily coordinated, and which is one of the reasons why when a regime finds such an attack, they want to block the internet as a first step. But the most important thing in all these regime changes is the critical role played by non-government organizations, NGOs. I remember it was in India when the Manmohan Singh became finance minister, and subsequent to that Narasimha Rao was prime minister. And at that time, there was this huge push to allow NGOs into India. And the argument in the media, it was all the media orchestrated thing, it was about governments have failed, government can only do so much, it is left to non-government organizations to do the real work of helping people, and so allow foreign funding for non-government organizations, the setup of these who all come as intended to help you develop your democratic values or help you socially, economically, and so on. Now that being the front, you have to look at the source of funding and the agendas behind. And so it started in India. And I've been watching this program across, let's say, the last 3 decades, how these NGOs have grown and what work they've been doing. All this you will understand when you look at some of the other examples, which we will read from shortly. And I'm going to start with this article, which is from the Guardian. This article in 2004, 26th November, is when the first revolution in Ukraine took place, and it was a regime change. You must understand that when the USSR broke up officially under Gorbachev, it was almost a miraculous intervention, because as a monolith, it was unbreakable. It had internally all the powers left to hold tightly and suppress any dissent. It needed someone at the top to allow it, and that was Gorbachev. But had he attempted it before the next layer was ready, they would have assassinated him and prevented him from doing what he did. So it's as if over time, the grassroots mood went through many layers until it reached the highest level, from where a trigger now could do what was needed. Still, a machinery is very tight. I remember at that time the data we were given. We were told that under the Soviet Union, in Romania, every third person was a government informer. That was the extent to which the intelligence system had wormed its way into society. People were afraid to speak freely, because just in case, if you had more than 3 people, one of them was an informer, and you wouldn't know who. And you were rewarded for informing, so with benefits and so on. So that's the level of control which is there. How do you break that? And I remember at that time when it happened, my teacher MP Pandit had also pointed to this, and it was very clear in the manner in which it happened that there was an intervention of the spiritual force, even a supramental intervention. And the mother had commented on the signs of the supramental intervention. She said, when she put a drop of the supramental consciousness, there was a massive shift overnight, and the scope was massive first. So suddenly the Soviet Union breaks down. And at the same time, it happens in such a way, so spontaneous, that looking back you say, oh yes, of course it was inevitable. Nothing could have prevented it. If not now, eventually it would have happened. And the third, it happens so smoothly that from one day to the next, everything moves smoothly, and there is no contradiction, no collision between the ideologies or the shift that takes place in consciousness. So these signs we saw very clearly in the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And at that time, it was one of those sources we had from somebody in Russia who actually said that Gorbachev was known to have even read Sri Aurobindo and things like that. I don't know if it's true, but we were told those things. So at that time, when Ukraine became independent of the Soviet Union, there was immediately the funding begun, and this is documented from the US side, that they began to fund the groups which were demanding greater independence from now separated Russia. So this program starts right then. So let's say through the 1990s, the funding is going on with these groups. Now 2004, a major intervention took place, and that was the first revolution. The second one was 2014, which then brought the present series in the regime. But let's look at what this article describes. It's by somebody called Ian Traynor. And this person obviously is well connected inside the cabal or State Department, because he's able to tell you exactly what they are doing and who's doing what. So his article starts with their websites and stickers, their pranks and slogans aimed at banishing widespread fear of a corrupt regime, the democracy guerrillas of the Ukrainian Pora youth movement have already notched up a famous victory, whatever the outcome of the dangerous standoff in Kiev. Now here are a few indications. Widespread fear of corrupt regime. So everyone is afraid. And here are the Ukrainian Pora youth who are democracy guerrillas. That means they are warriors who are in a military mission against the corrupt regime. Now it's not an exaggeration, as you will see, they are documenting those things. And now there's a standoff. These people have already won major victories. Then he says, Ukraine, traditionally passive in its politics, has been mobilized by the young democracy activists and will never be the same again. So watch these things always. Whenever there's a regime change, they will use young people. Why? Because young people are full of fiery blood. they don't know enough of the past. So you can easily brainwash them with new information that says, oh, this is wrong, and you have all been suffering for decades or centuries or through many generations, except you don't know better because you've never actually been connected to the whole history. And you catch them young and brainwash them early. And they are activists, they have lots of free time, they have lots of energy, they can do many things, they're willing to take risks. Catch them in their teenage when their blood is hot, testosterone is flowing high, you're willing to do dangerous things, risky things, not realizing that it's a biological impulse. But you call them democracy activists. And it doesn't matter what they do, you always say the key word that is currently in fashion. So if it's not democracy, it will be social justice. If it's not that, it will be in the name of God, your warrior for God, work of God, etc. Then he says, but while the gains of the orange bedecked chestnut revolution are Ukraine's, the campaign is an American creation, very openly stating it. A sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. So, Western branding and mass marketing has toppled 4 in 4 years, 4 countries in 4 years. What? Rigged election and topple unsavory regimes. So if the US State Department does not like the regime because it's not kowtowing to its interests, they're unsavory, you topple them. Rigged elections sometimes, but may not always be. Irrespective. If it's unsavory, that's good enough. You can always say it was rigged and topple them. And we'll see how they declare it is rigged. It's also very, very carefully done, and you'll understand many things which happened in the last 1 month in India. Next he says, funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, and 2 big American parties and US non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in the year 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. So in Belgrade, they toppled Slobodan Milosevic government using the same techniques. But look at what's involved. US government first, US consultancies, and that's a very broad term. Pollsters, remember all polls are rigged, doesn't matter where, in the US or in India or anywhere else, all are rigged. Because if you had an independent poll, eventually deep state will say, hey, we need to control this, and they'll find a way to get in or discredit you so much that you will fail. And it needs money to run a good poll. So, pollsters, diplomats. Now these are people who have immunity, so they can actually go around, commit crimes, and they will not be arrested. And these are the people at the top level of the controls. And 2 big American parties and US non-government organizations, 2 big ones. Now with the names of which he will tell you shortly. So they already did it. Milosevic was overthrown. Now a name. Richard Miles, the US ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, as US ambassador in Tbilisi, I don't know how you pronounce it, he repeated the trick in Georgia, coaching Mikhail Saakashvili in how to bring down Eduard Shevardnadze. So they're openly telling you what they did, regime change in all these places. Then they will tell you how they do it. 10 months after the success in Belgrade, the US ambassador in Minsk, Mikhail Kozak, a veteran of similar operations in Central America, notably in Nicaragua, organized a near identical campaign to try to defeat the Belarus hardman Alexander Lukashenko. Now you see, this ambassador, he's not picked at random. He has already run similar operations in Central America, notably in Nicaragua where he had excellent results, but many others. He's experienced with this toolkit, template. And now he applies this in Belgrade. Then, 10 months after the success in Belgrade, the US ambassador in... So, then he says, when he attempted this in Belgrade, he says, that one failed. There will be no Kostunica in Belarus, the Belarus president declared, referring to the victory in Belgrade. So they attempted regime change that failed, but they were able to push almost to the brink. And it fails. Doesn't matter. Next time they will win because they've already set the thing in motion and they'll keep building on it. They don't worry about that. They think long term. Then he says, but the experience gained in Serbia, Georgia, Belarus has been invaluable in plotting to beat the regime of Leonid Kuchma in Kiev. So you have experience across several countries. Now you're targeting the next country. And with all that experience, you won't make those mistakes. You'll be more effective this time. The operation, engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience, is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. You see the celebration by this reporter, but the kind of knowledge he shares, obviously he's very much connected inside the machinery. And you must understand, until Trump came to power, the deep state and the cabal were so powerful that they had nothing to fear by speaking openly of these things. When things reversed, that they had to start hiding and put things, some of their actions behind. Today, under the freedom of speech in Twitter, for example, again there is a fear. So they have to be more careful. They layer some of their actions at least 1 or 2 steps. So, engineering democracy. The moment you engineer democracy, it's not democracy anymore, isn't it? It is a sham, it's a pretense of democracy. Through the ballot box and civil disobedience. So you can control ballot box and you combine it with civil disobedience to compel the changes. Now you'll see both of these used to be very common in India. Under the previous regimes, ballot box stuffing was very common. And there would be a gang which would just come, pick the ballot box and stuff all the papers, take away the rest of the papers and go away. And the election official would be told, if you ever raise an issue about this, your family will be killed. Everyone who's watched it, who's waiting in the queue to put their vote, sees this and is helpless. So it's a very organized operation with a level of corruption and threat which is hardcore gundaism. Of course, that has changed now. And it's interesting how that change also took place. But he says the methods are so slick. Slick means smooth, you cannot detect, and matured into a template for winning other people's elections, and the template can now be applied everywhere. So, in the center of Belgrade, there is a dingy office staffed by computer literate youngsters who call themselves the Center for Nonviolent Resistance. Now you will see all these NGOs will call themselves democracy, non-violence, all the keywords which will draw sympathy. But what they actually do will be very different, as you will see. If you want to know how to beat a regime that controls the mass media, the judges, the courts, security apparatus and the voting stations, the young Belgrade activists are for hire. In other words, they're not doing it because of some great love for their country. For them, it's a job. You pay them money, they will do anything for anyone to win. Now, you've created a few such cells of people for hire, trained them in your template, and they know how to control the mass media, judges, security, voting stations, etc. And if you've trained them in one place, now you can apply them in the other countries. So what do? They go as tourists in the other country and go through their activism, which is what happens here, you will see. They emerged from the anti-Milosevic student movement, Otpor, meaning resistance. The catchy single word branding is important. So now our writer is teaching us some of the techniques they use. Catchy single word branding. So you find them repeating one word, and the repeating is like a hypnotic trigger, and it's linked to a certain idea, and it builds a force. So it has to be catchy. And at that time it was Otpor, resistance. Against what? Doesn't matter. It's an abstract idea. So you just resist irrespective of who it is, against who it is, until your work is done. So it's a violence of an extreme order. It's not non-violent at all. In Georgia last year, the parallel student movement was Khmara. Catchy single word. In Belarus, it was Zubr. In Ukraine, it is Pora, meaning high time. So you say, Pora, enough, now high time, change. For what? No reason given. It's just an end in itself. Otpor also had a potent, simple slogan that appeared everywhere in Serbia in 2000. The two words Gotovje, meaning he's finished, a reference to Milosevic. A logo of a black and white clenched fist completed the masterful marketing. So recognize this is a marketing program of a multinational force. Think about it this way. The way they would sell you foods that they want you to eat. And they start young and build it across a generation or two. I remember when the Western media was finally allowed in India freely under television, through television. Again, that same period when Manmohan Singh became finance minister and they opened up the country, so to say, liberalized the economy and weakened the rupee. All these multinationals which came in, selling you fast foods and junk foods, all had their advertising aimed at children. So little children saying, "Mummy, I want to have this particular noodle or that brand or that brand." When they give it, they're very happy and the mummy is pleased because now finally children eat, otherwise they don't eat, they don't like the usual traditional foods. And I was wondering, why do they aim at children? And then it struck me, they're aiming 20 years ahead. These people will become parents. That's when they will feed it to their children. You won't need to advertise later. And this is what has happened. So they're thinking very far ahead. They are going to own the country. Except here they're interested in selling their noodles or whatever other products. The other place, they're selling their brand of control at a political level. The mechanism of marketing is the same. The psychology of marketing is the same. So a logo of black and white clenched fist completed the masterful marketing. Now this black and white clenched fist, where have you seen it elsewhere? Antifa. Where else before that? The Nazi youth ideology, which had the exact same image as, or rather Antifa has the exact same image as the Nazi youth flag. Exact same. And you have to think about why and what does this mean. And here is some of the occult symbolism used by the Cabal. And they infuse the symbolism with a certain force. So it's not casual. It's not just masterful marketing of a symbol. There's a energy and an occult energy which is used to back some of these symbolisms. So the article continues. In Ukraine, the equivalent is a ticking clock, also signaling that the Kuchma regime's days are numbered. Now what happens? How do the activists operate and how are they trained? Stickers, spray paint and websites are the young activists' weapons. Irony and street comedy mocking the regime have been hugely successful in puncturing public fear and enraging the powerful. Now see how this works. They've studied the ground level situation. People are afraid. How do you remove the fear? You create these street comedy. And the point of street comedy is one person is doing a performance with 20 people on the street. You make them laugh, so they come to have a laugh. But in the process, you're programming them. And if at that time the police come, you can easily vanish. If you do an organized program on a theater or a cinema, that can be censored. This you can't censor. Or if they do censor and they catch this guy, jail him or beat him, then the other side, the group which is backing him, will make headlines about it. See how a casual teenager was bashed up by the big bad bully who's afraid of one person. Oh, what a courageous man he is. So you have many ways in which this can be amplified. And now you have many young activists doing this. What else do they do? Stickers, spray paint and websites. Why? Because you want to create an illusion that everybody is talking about it. I'll step back from this a moment. There was an article, there's a word in English language which is very peculiar, and it is called quiz. And the nature of the origin of this word, we are told, is it was a bet between two Englishmen. One of them said, I can introduce a new word into the English language overnight. And so they made a bet. This man went the next day, or that night, he went all over the city and wrote the word QIZ, QUIZ, QUIZ everywhere. The next day, everybody was asking, what is quiz? What is quiz? What is quiz? No one has heard this word. It doesn't exist in the English language. And because everyone is talking about it, the word acquired a meaning, quiz, as a question. That's it. He had introduced a word. Now, the same programming is used when people advertise. So if you see everywhere you go, you see the same product displayed. And you're given the impression that everybody is using it and talking about it anyway. Then you tend to conform. So this is how they create, for example, so-called viral videos. When one of the cabal-controlled music videos, singers is released, they will build the teaser, they'll build the anticipation in the media, etc. But the day it is released, they will say it shot to top of charts. No, it did not. What happened was every media, social media platform promoted it as first. So you clicked on it. As a result, it shot to high number of views. You may think nothing of it. You may think, oh, what a silly thing, what an ugly, crude thing. But what you see next day is so many millions sold overnight. It's like everybody was waiting. I'm the only one thinking it's ugly and crude. Except I ask 20 people and all people I know think that it's ugly and crude. Who actually buys it? And you'll see the media will tell you, that's what the young people want. And I ask the young people, no, we don't find it interesting. But that's what everybody likes. I don't like, but everybody else likes. You've created the illusion that everybody likes. It has become normalized. You have an echo chamber. So when all over you have spray paints and stickers, you get the impression that everybody is now for the revolution. In India, it used to be that you would have the stickers for the political parties. You would have these loud vans with loudspeakers, amplifiers shouting the name, hammering away at you day and night during the election season, peaking to the day just before elections, to such a degree as if you get overwhelmed by the construction. What they're actually doing, whether conscious or not, is building this occult formation, thought form, emotional form, link it to strong emotional reactions for which you need events just before that, people dying, killing, or being raped, or whatever it is, which would swing you to a direction or other, and hammering away the message. And everywhere you go, every street corner, every wall has this logo, this poster, this message. Oh, everyone, it's there, it's everywhere, and nobody is able to do anything about it. And that's set a pace for you to accept whatever is done in regime change. Tomorrow when a leader is removed or killed, you say, yes, everybody wanted it. Even if I didn't want, everybody wanted, so you accept. So this is a very powerful method used, and it's critical to regime change. So observe the method and you will recognize when it's used. So he says, stickers, spray paint websites, and then irony and street comedy to puncture public fear and enrage the powerful. So the powerful may not get enraged, but you'll have newspaper story that says they are upset. Then, last year, before becoming president in Georgia, the US educated Mr. Saakashvili traveled to Tbilisi to Belgrade to be coached in the techniques of mass defiance. In Belarus, the US embassy organized the dispatch of young opposition leaders to the Baltic, where they met up with Serbs traveling from Belgrade. In Serbia's case, given the hostile environment in Belgrade, the Americans organized the overthrow from neighboring Hungary, Budapest, and Szeged. Now you see the level of coordination across countries, bringing people in across the border to do the work, to organize, and to link up groups. Now, who is orchestrating? Who can control so many groups and make them act simultaneously? Understand how many years before the preparation of the control of these groups was built up. Normally at least 10 years. So 10 years you will have the Serbs, you will have the young opposition leaders from Belarus, and then people coming from Budapest and Szeged. All these people have already been prepared, trained, and now they're being made to align in a collective action. Think about what this involves. And the US educated Saakashvili is being coached in techniques of mass defiance. Now it's important that he's US educated, because during their education, seeing them as potential leaders or children of potential leaders, they got already indoctrinated. Very subtly, they were given friends from childhood while they were in the US school who are controllers to become their friends for the future. So this happens very often in India, for example, and it will be, I suppose it's everywhere. Children of military, admirals, generals, or Air Force, anybody high up, or children of politicians, when they apply for education abroad, particularly in the US or Europe, immediately they are granted, and then those children are watched. A child of an existing CIA operative is put in the same school, made to become friends, and they are friendships for life, which become later link points for controls and other means. And if at a young age, as teenage, they've been photographed in compromising situations, they are blackmailed for life. This is a programming. It's not just there. It's done. If you had your children go to USSR or China, it would be the same story. Everybody does it. It's just nobody talks about it openly. But it's important, this observation that US educated Mr. Saakashvili. He's coached in techniques of mass defiance. That means you have a template. Now you're teaching this leader, training him to do what you need to do. Except, not all people are capable of being good leaders or doing what you train them to do well. So eventually you start looking for people who would be competent for it. So I will come to that point shortly. But I've actually met in India one of these persons who's a trainer in what they call Gandhian activism. And it was a couple. They were, their whole life mission was training people for what they called non-violent resistance. So I happened to be in a conference where they were present and they were talking about what they do, how they train, and they teach you to form these human walls and grip each other, how to grip each other so that if the police comes to break your group, they cannot. And if they somehow manage to break it, they'll break a bone in the process so that they can be accused again of being overtly violent, etc. And then all the methods they were describing. What was interesting was later, it was somebody else's turn, the conference was not about this, but whatever. This fellow was sitting next to me. Suddenly he leans down with his elbow, intensely presses on my thigh until it's painful. And I pull away, and then he laughs with a smug, content laugh because he could cause pain. I was surprised. I can go back. I'm again concentrating, listening. Again he leans and creates this intense, violent pain. A trainer for non-violence. Observe what's happening. Physical non-violence, psychological intense violence, hatred, and joy in causing pain. Interesting, isn't it? This was Sri Aurobindo's observation and criticism of Gandhi's approach. He said, you're speaking of non-violence physically, but you're inflicting the most horrible violence on the whole country. And that was his criticism. And in fact, it's the reverse that should happen. It is in the psychology that we have to be free of violence. Non-violence, he said, is a psychological principle, not a physical principle. Physically, even eating food is a violence in a sense. You have to chew and crush the plant or whatever else. But I'm pointing to this, that they have trainers like this. And the trainers are dedicated for life to this kind of work, and they are themselves extremely violent as people. But what they teach you is an appearance of non-violence, because that's what you need to play the media and to play the public. So you see how this kind of mobilization takes place across with trained people, and they infiltrate. So be careful about what's happening in the US when the infiltrations are happening. Just last 1 month, it is 270,000 or so illegal infiltrators in the US. Who's coming in? And how many of these are trained guerrilla, military, or other such regime change operatives from other countries? We don't know. So I continue with the text. So I'm describing these things to give a fuller picture because the text is very suggestive, but you have to understand the full picture behind. Text continues. In recent weeks, several Serbs traveled to the Ukraine. Indeed, one of the leaders from Belgrade, Alexander Maric, was turned away at the border. So at the border they're checking. They do recognize some of these are operatives who are coming to do mischief, but the new ones are not recognized, so they get in. The Democratic Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party's International Republican Institute, the US State Department and the USAID are the main agencies involved in these grassroots campaigns, as well as the Freedom House NGO and billionaire George Soros's Open Society Institute. Now they're naming all the vehicles through which this kind of governmental overthrow is taking place. It's interesting, you see how in the United States you have the illusion of two parties. Actually, both are funded by the same people, controlled by the same people, and Trump was a thorn for both sides. They all hated him because he was overthrowing their interests, questioning and preventing them. It was the same in India. As I've mentioned before, I don't need to repeat, in Tamil Nadu, all the parties were hand in glove. In the center, they were all hand in glove. In appearance, they would be criticizing each other. They would fight elections separately. Once the election results were out, they would combine with each other and take over. All opportunists. Nobody really had any values until BJP and particularly Modi brought about a shift. So the same in the US. What happens? Democratic Party has a National Democratic Institute funding regime change. Republican Party has an International Republican Institute funding regime change. US State Department directly funding regime change. US Aid, which is supposed to be a US NGO to help people for economic or other changes, is funding regime change. These are the main agencies, as well as private NGOs, Freedom House and George Soros Open Society Institute. I think now it's Open Society Foundation. So Freedom House and Open Society Foundation are the big money today because the US State Department can't be seen to be openly funding, so they use these as a front and they route funds through many of these first grade and second grade NGOs. What you will see, for example, Hamas received huge amount of funding from George Soros's Open Society Institute. And why, you have to ask, what are they funding? Has there been any, under Hamas rule, openness of society, openness of education, of thought or democratic values? Zero. Where did the money go? Weapons, underground, military installations. That's all it got. And do you think the Open Society Foundation was not aware that the money is going there? So you have to recognize that whatever may be their public posturing, and the name itself Open Society Foundation, is not what they do. What they do is very different. I don't want to reveal too much which gets into a private space, but I have actually met a politician of a country, so I'm leaving it very open, but it's somebody I know who said to me one day, he got a donation of X amount. I will not go into details at all, but it's a substantial sum. And it was from one of George Soros's foundations. And he asked, but why are you giving me this money? They said, oh, we appreciate your work. So he says, great. So each month the money keeps coming. So eventually he calls them up and says, what do you expect from me? They said, no, we just like your work. If you like, you can give us a report of what you're doing. So he says, okay. And so diligently he starts preparing a report every month for what he's doing and sends it to this office. One month it happens, he cannot because he's been too busy. Someone is sick, I don't know what. He can't send the report. So he calls them up and says, I'm really sorry, I couldn't send the report this time. And they tell him, we don't care about your report. You like, you send. If you don't like, you don't send. We'll just keep giving you money. Keep doing what you're doing. Now you understand how this works. For a politician, especially when you are nascent and when you're rising, that kind of financial commitment, it goes far. It also means eventually at some point the strings will be pulled and you'll be asked to do things or else the money stops. Except you have now got used to this level of financial benefit. I'll give another example, not in the political space. Many of you would have heard of Dr. Stephen Greer. Stephen Greer is one of those in the ufology field who was the founder of the Disclosure Project, which made, in fact, one of the biggest revelations in the year 2001 when they had several dozen senior Navy and Army and Air Force generals and others speak up about UFOs and even the fact that they had secret programs and so on. Stephen Greer actually says this in public. He says he has been offered many times from the cabal side to buy him out. And one of the things they said, we will give you a credit card. You can spend all you want, do what you like. There'll be no questions asked. So he said, and then what do you expect from me? Well, we want you to stop talking about what you're talking about. That's it. He said, no, I won't be owned by you. But that's the offer. Somebody who's tempted by that would say, all right, I'll have my cushy life. Anyway, it makes no difference what I say or not, because they control things. And so it's easy to slip into this kind of control. But it's an example of what I'm sharing. Okay, so we continue with the text. US pollsters and professional consultants are hired to organize focus groups and use psephological data to plot strategy. Now, remember, this is what is done normally before you launch a product. So let's say this multinational wants to launch its noodles. They will do focus groups. That means they call groups from different groups of economical, social, or other types. And they will be told a word. What does this evoke for you? They'll be shown a picture. What does this evoke for you? Do you prefer this or that? Are you likely to buy this or that? And so through a process of testing on ground with people, you optimize your advertising strategy, keywords used, and messaging. So for example, you'll be asked, is for you the color more important, or the smell more important, or the price more important, or the idea that it's good for your health more important? And the entire advertising strategy will be built on what information is taken from them. So this is what is called focus group. Then psephological data is the data for who votes for whom, which community votes for whom, and so on. So US pollsters and professional consultants, this is like a multinational operating, organize focus groups and psephological data. These are hired, everybody is being paid. By who? By these institutions, including the governments. So imagine the kind of engagement involved financially as well as strategically for the results you want to achieve. You cannot miss if you do this well. So for a country like India, it means every single state, every single community within each state, down to all the major cities, and particularly they will target what are called swing states or swing districts. So certain states it's known, oh, such and such party will win, no way. There's no option for you to change. But still they will try. They'll look for the weak points, they'll do the analysis and push and optimize down a couple of elections. But they will focus on these areas where you can tilt the whole thing. Now, for example, for a state, the balance between two parties may be 6 people, more on one side or other. Those 6 are from 6 specific, let's say, regions, electoral constituencies. They will focus on those 6. If you can swing these 6, then you've won. You can tilt the party which you want. Or extend it to 2 or 3 more, which are the weak constituencies where you can create a bit of controversy and create a swing, additional swing, and so on. So there's an analysis which is taking place down to grassroots level. And if you look at the example of the Joshua project that I mentioned before, every house is marked for whether it is open to conversion, if it has been converted, or it's resistant, all over India. That tells you the kind of depth these analyses can go into for purpose of elections. Today it's so much easier. 2004 it was not. Today every human being has a mobile phone through which you're being monitored, and all the psephological data as well as the focus group studies are being done on you through your mobile phone, through social media, and accumulated with artificial intelligence at the top to swing you and to swing entire countries. So Facebook, for example, is on record saying that we do social engineering experiments. So they will show you this or that image and see how you respond. They'll give you an image or a message criticizing X leader. They give you another image praising, or another criticizing a Y leader or praising a Y leader, and watch how you respond to each of these. Based on your response, they've detected who you like and how much. So once you have that, they'll start feeding you data which will try to weaken your loyalty and see how you respond to that data. They'll try out 5 different approaches. For example, typically it's moral, sexual misbehavior, or theft, or financial, or lying, or some caricature of the person. They'll try different things and see which one hooks you more. Things which you reject, things which you accept, and then, as was described earlier here, make light of it, make fun of it, mock the person, and see how you respond. To weaken your commitment, allegiance, sow seeds of doubt, and watch how you respond. And based on that, optimize the targeting. And all this today is done through social media with such sophistication and automation, you don't need a human being on the other side. It's a program AI trained which is now doing it to you, following its training. So the scaling on humanity is so easy. And this is the reason why Google, Apple, or Facebook, etc., are willing to pay billions to own an app. You see, when WhatsApp was sold, I believe it was $6 billion. When WhatsApp was sold to Facebook, do you think Facebook cannot recreate the code of WhatsApp? In 3 days, they could recreate the entire code. What they cannot recreate is your loyalty to that app. So rather than creating another app that competes, to which you may or may not turn, they would rather buy the app with $6 billion so that they own you and have access to you. That's why you are worth that much, not the app. App is nothing. I can write it within a few days. So remember, the goal behind social media is this engineering, to understand you and optimize using precisely these methods, which focus group and psephological analysis, and then swing you by bombarding you daily with messaging to be able to modify your belief or loyalty. We go to the next in the text, the next paragraph. The usual fractious oppositions have to be united behind a single candidate if there is to be any chance of unseating the regime. That leader is selected on pragmatic and objective grounds, even if he or she is anti-American. Now you see how this works. You see what's happening in India. This so-called opposition unity is orchestrated. They all hate each other. They all talk completely contrary to each other. But what's holding them together? There's a massive program to oppose and unseat Modi, for which all the oppositions have been united. And they named themselves India, which is very weird. So now in the newspaper it'll say, India decides to do this. No, India didn't decide. It was the acronym, the abbreviation is INDI, Alliance. But the media will not say Indi Alliance. They will say India Group or India Alliance. And it's part of the subtle programming. India has decided. And then I look at it and say, but that's not what I want. Oh, but India has decided. And it acts subliminally. And you may think it is a joke. It's not. This is how post-hypnotic suggestions work. And it's extremely deep. If you say India has decided, it actually influences you. And subliminally, subconsciously, it programs your behavior. And so, unifying oppositions. Imagine US State Department has the power to unify the opposition in a country they are targeting. How long do you think it will take them to bring themselves to this point that they can force an opposition to come together, although they all hate each other, and accept a leader on pragmatic grounds? How much money might be involved, or how much coercion of other kinds, including blackmail if needed. But mostly, as you can see in India, they're all just greedy for money. Pay them enough, they will do what they like. But what is interesting is they don't mind an anti-American person coming. So when you see a regime change which is anti-American and speaks anti-American, doesn't mean America was not behind it. Rather, State Department was not behind it. They don't care. As long as they've thrown the other person, this fellow is a puppet. He can talk all he wants. His actions will be what matter. And they control the actions. So, in Serbia, US pollsters Penn, Schoen and Berland Associates discovered that the assassinated pro-Western opposition leader Zoran Dinčić was reviled at home and had no chance of beating Milosevic fairly in an election. He was persuaded to take a backseat to the anti-Western Vojislav Kostunica, who is now Serbian Prime Minister. Can you imagine this? The 3 pollsters operating inside Serbia. US pollsters. They didn't even hire Serbian pollsters because they can't trust them. So they hire US pollsters who are hiring people. How do you think a US pollster gets inside Serbia and does a poll? They set up shop there locally. They hire people, they train them and do under what guise? So there's an entire cover operation by which the government there won't know it's a US pollster doing the polls. You understand how this works, why these NGOs are so important. And they can be doing it under the guise of helping people grow economically, helping women. But what they do, they go to the women and say, who will you vote for? Why don't you like this person? Why do you like that? And that's the polling happening going back to the US State Department through 3 layers of influence, of separation. So you can never pin it on them, if not for the article which says it openly. And so they realize this opposition leader will not win. They can persuade him to take a back seat and allow someone else to take a position of prime minister. How do you persuade this man? He's up for sale or he's totally blackmailed. The point is he's controlled one way or other. A prime ministerial candidate that you thought was the opposition is totally controlled from outside. What happens to the guy who is elected finally is totally controlled. And if your prime minister that you thought you are freely elected is so totally controlled that he is willing to take a back seat or come forward, he will do anything that the other side, the controllers, demand of him. Understand the degree to which the controls go. And they will make all the public statements. They like to criticize the US to distance themselves and pretend to be free. But in fact, they are total puppets when it comes to action. So, in Belarus, US officials ordered opposition parties to unite behind the dour, elderly trade unionist Vladimir Goncharik because he appealed to much of Lukashenko's constituency. US official ordered opposition parties to unite behind this dour, elderly trade unionist, whom they all hated. Imagine the power and control that it demands, and that was already in place in all these countries, Serbia, Belarus. Now remember I listed all these countries earlier in which the regime change took place in what was called the color revolutions? Entirely controlled. You were given the illusion by your media telling you, oh, it happened spontaneously, people woke up, spontaneously people said step down, they threw out somebody. No, it's entirely orchestrated down to each individual in the opposition party is controlled. Not one of them squeaks out and says we are being bullied by the US to choose X, we don't want. All are controlled. No exception. Even one person being an exception would have spoken out. There's not one exception. Understand how deep the controls are. Officially, the US government spent $41 million organizing and funding the year-long operation to get rid of Milosevic from October 1999. In Ukraine, the figure is said to be around $14 million. This is just for the 2004 overthrow. We're not talking of 2014, which was a different story, which we will touch next time. So, 1 year operation. Obviously, before that, operation for overthrow was the base set, which can be activated at will. And I gave an example last time of how these cells are created, and in India, the cells were there waiting for years until one was activated to create this crisis in parliament, untraceable. To this day, you can't find the original source of the funding because it's a cell of 5 people across states, trained and waiting, sitting, doing nothing until they are activated to self-immolate, etc., or do whatever is required, and to go to jail, even for life if needed. Who would do that? Only somebody who's assured that there would be a reward worth it. So think about what that means. Next, he says, apart from the student movement and the united opposition, the other key elements in the democracy template is what is known as the parallel vote tabulation, a counter to the election rigging tricks beloved of disreputable regimes. What is that parallel vote tabulation? There are professional outside election monitors from bodies such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But the Ukrainian poll, like its predecessors, also featured thousands of local election monitors trained and paid by Western groups. So what is this method where from the West money is coming to train these monitors? They are being paid across months on a salary, on a full-fledged salary, and their job is to swing the elections or swing the data of the election poll result. We'll see what that comes to. But who are the 3 groups now? Observe this. Student movement, united opposition, and the parallel vote tabulation group. This is the template. You have to act on all 3. Now let's look at what this parallel vote tabulation group does. Freedom House and Democratic Party's NDI helped fund and organize the largest, quote, largest civil regional election monitoring effort in Ukraine, unquote, involving more than 1,000 trained observers. Now imagine 1,000 trained observers being paid a salary for several months during the training and then during the observation, and then to keep silent. They also organized exit polls. On Sunday night, those polls gave Mr. Yushchenko an 11-point lead and set the agenda for much of what has followed. So what happens is, before elections, they are promoting a certain story. So and so will win. Don't waste your vote on the other. That already tilts about 10 to 20% people. Next, as soon as the vote is done, they will do what is called an exit poll, and it doesn't matter what the actual number is, they will announce a certain number. Now, if the actual outcome deviates substantially, they will then claim that there was election rigging. That's the game. And it doesn't matter whether there was rigging or not. You can create the impression that there's an election rigging because independent observers claim that this is the exit poll and that poll cannot be trusted. Our poll is more correct. And it creates doubt. The exit polls are seen as critical because they seize the initiative in the propaganda battle with the regime, invariably appearing first, receiving wide media coverage, and putting the onus on the authorities to respond. So suddenly you say, oh, X is going to win by a 20% margin, and then the official results come back says, no, it's Y which won. Then you say, oh, that is wrong. And people now get restless. Because we trusted independent NGOs, right? And these people are the bad ones because they are the ones who are asserting their authority. And even if I voted for X, I know the mood, the impression created through media, the mood was for Y, and so I hold back the fact that I voted for this bad guy, and now he's bad, and this is how the mood is swung. The onus is on the authorities to respond. And what do the authorities do? They deny. They say, no, there was obviously no election rigging. So X denies election rigging. That becomes the headline. But now election rigging becomes the theme, subconsciously. And on the other side, the Y, who was promoted by the outside interests, starts doing street demonstrations, public demonstrations, non-violent resistance, and it starts building up bit by bit until eventually there's a head-off with police. You see, this has happened in India many times when you had this group under the farmers' agitation last year or year before, 2 years ago. They came into Delhi with tractors, tried to jam all the roads, went to the main places which were high security during the 26th January Republic Day. When the Prime Minister would hoist the flag, they tried to infiltrate and block the crowds, create a security threat. So the moment the police comes forward to protect, there's a tension, and now they will deliberately cause violence that requires force that is videoed and put out. Or, as the two are facing each other, somebody will shoot at the police and the police will shoot back. People have to die. With the martyrdom comes the freedom because it swings people's opinions. So you understand how they work, but now they have the advantage, and on the other side is the authorities which have to respond, and whatever they may respond, it will be used against them. Then the final stage in the US template concerns now how to react when the incumbent tries to steal a lost election. In Belarus, President Lukashenko won, so the response was minimal. In Belgrade, Tbilisi, and now Kiev, Ukraine, where the authorities initially tried to cling to power, the advice was to stay cool but determined and to organize mass displays of civil disobedience, which must remain peaceful but risk provoking the regime into violent suppression. So overtly they have to be peaceful, but they keep trying to provoke and provoke until there's a reaction. And then you say, yes, violent suppression. And you attack the regime and soil their reputation further. Then, if the events in Kiev vindicate the US in its strategies for helping other people win elections and take power from anti-democratic regimes, it is certain to try to repeat the exercise elsewhere in the post-Soviet world. And places to watch are Moldova and the authoritarian countries of Central Asia. So this is the article, it ends with this, and you get a picture of how this works. If you look at the other links, you will understand how many countries are affected, how they're affected, and so on. I won't touch this further except now to say, in all this toolkit, while everything is being set up which is not dependent on who will be elected, which is controlled purely by the financials and the training and the template and the toolkit, the person they select has to have some level of competence to be able to work within the framework of this toolkit and subsequently for the propaganda objectives. Who best? If you take this dour looking fellow, he's not very good at putting up an act. He cannot put up the necessary expressions to swing people to make them like you. You see, in the United States, often these were film stars. In India, you'll see a lot of film stars who get into politics. Why? Because people already have an adoration, and you can swing them with what? The image you created in the roles that you played in cinema. I remember it was in one of these discussion groups. Somewhere I posted how a certain film star in India had said some very nasty comments about India, against India. And there was a girl who said, "Oh, what a pity, I used to like her very much." Now think about this. You like a film star, why? You've never met them. You've never interacted with them socially. You've only seen the role they played. You like the role they played. And for you, that is the person. No, it's not. But since you have that image, if that image can be perfected to what you expect to be your prime minister, that would be the easiest way to slip somebody into your country, isn't it? Which is the reason why so many film stars turn to politics. You see that in Tamil Nadu, of course, very obviously, but in Andhra Pradesh, most of the states today, there is this tendency. In the United States equally, including Ronald Reagan as a film star, becomes president, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and so on. So why? Because first, they have already a positive image. Second, as film actors, they can put up a display of anything. They know how to play you with their expressions, with their voice, with their intonation, and to swing you emotionally, and they already have perhaps a charisma with which they can hook you. So if you wanted to, through such a template of revolution, prop up somebody, whom would you choose? Somebody who already has an image, who has a charisma, and who has the skill of swinging, isn't it? What better than a film star? You notice also when there is this public programming done against somebody by the media, the moment your film stars making statements for or against someone, be sure that this is a controlled play by cabal interests or other interests sometimes. Film stars' opinion on politics, economics, or otherwise has zero value. They are merely paid actors. They will swing any way they want, any way you want, depending on how much you pay. That being the case, look at the enormous influence they have. And so, if you had to prop up somebody, what would you do? And so what I've done in the links that I've shared here, I have put a few more links which are quite fascinating, and I want you to look at these next. What are the links? One of them is Zelensky, current Prime Minister of Ukraine, as an actor with voice control for a role that is called Paddington. It's a cartoon creature. And look at the video. Observe carefully how he is able to play his voice and his expressions. He's a very skillful actor. Zelensky was a comedian. Next link is Zelensky's TV series that he himself promotes with him as the main actor. And what is the TV series starting in 2015 till 2019? He has a TV series in which a teacher inadvertently becomes president, I think. So, 2015 to 2019, this TV series is promoted like crazy. So, common people are now seeing this actor who's a teacher, young man with all the normal common man problems, suddenly becoming a president and struggling with the corruption, and he is so honest, so clean that the corruption is against him, and he survives and manages to change the system. 2019 is when the series ends, is when this man stands for elections and gets elected as an actor with no other competence, because an image created by a series which is exactly what you needed to program people. And interesting, if you look at the data of the series, it's the only TV series which is actually put for free on YouTube. That means they made no money on it, practically. Why would somebody spend so much money, 3 seasons, 51 episodes, and put it all for free? Unless the goal was to reach as many people as possible. And then the media promotes it, wonderful series, so great, so wonderful, and you're made to watch it. And then you're programmed to say, here is the man I trust, I respect. This is what I want him to do in real life. And he gets elected. But observe how skillful he is as an actor in the previous link. And then comes the next link which I've put. It shows Zelensky dancing in high heels with satanic symbolism. It is part of a group called Kvartal 95. The full video is also put with the lyrics. He is dancing with a group in very ugly, crude gestures, wearing black and moving his body in the most convoluted ways, wearing high heels, making gestures, symbolism which are satanic, and music which is outright satanic, words which are outright satanic. And if you look at the translation of the words, I'm just going to read a few words so you get an idea. Let's pour a glass of martini, let's be gay, for will, for fate, for truth, let's be gay. Be gay, you yourself are gay, for Yulia, for the soul. Here's my mace, my brothers, tomorrow we are going dancing against Muscovites. Let's dance, hopak, we have the power, Ukraine is not dead. You also have Borscht, lard, that is fat, onion, horseradish, eat, drink, I'm drinking what, lovers, exile, all in gloss, ugh for them, artist, stylists out, lipsticks, gay parades, everyone is like that. Here is my mace, my brothers, tomorrow we are going to dance against the Muscovites. That's the wording. I drink, I'm drinking what? Meaningless, right? It's full of cabal symbolism, but also directed towards, we are going to go attack Muscovites. He's doing a dance which is full of cabal symbolism, crude, ugly, and you can say, make everyone gay, but attack Moscow, Ukraine is strong. That's the messaging. Now, this is a fact. This man has actually done this, and if you look at the mainstream media, they try to cover it up saying, yes, but it was only a caricature of some other very popular music video. No, it was not. It was an independent show they did. But even if you claim that it is a caricature of the other popular video, that one is even more ugly. And there the wordings go like this: you want me, you love me, you hate me, I don't care. I wanna F you, money, trend, fame, sex, BM club, fashion, you, Garrett, Pug, I want F you, money, trend, fame, sex. That's what it is. Of which they've made a repetition, or supposedly, with similar ugliness. Now, this does not happen by chance. This is not a career move. This is a cabal-controlled satanic participant playing his symbolism to his master. And I'm putting all this together to show you the context of who this man is, who was then propped up and promoted to become set as president of Ukraine. Now, look at the links. See for yourself. I put the translation also of the lyrics on the link there. And you'll get an idea of how the system actually works. We have looked at broadly the framework of the technology template for regime change. Look at the patterns, observe how it works in India, observe how it works in other countries, students groups, demonstrating, etc. All the rest, you have a framework. It's actually slightly more refined than what is presented here, but broadly in the same direction. And I think this was my intention today, to describe how the engineering of revolutions takes place, specifically now focusing at what happened in Ukraine in 2004, which is the base for what happens in 2014, which then decides what happens in 2019 with Zelensky, and then the war. So this last part is what we will focus next time. So we'll look at certain specifics of how the revolution was engineered in 2014, and you'll see the patterns of this. And specifically, there was a point where these young people went and walked against the police, so holding hands, etc. But they were wearing bulletproof vests. They were wearing high resistance helmets and so on, fully clothed, as would be a group that is going to war. Now, this does not come by chance. It is not spontaneous. Yes, the media tells you there was a spontaneous demonstration which went and collided with the police. No. What happened then was, while they were in a head-off with the police, a shot was fired against the police. By who? We don't know. Obviously, someone from this side. The police fired back, and that led to the unrest which led to the overthrow of the regime. We saw something similar in in the example of Ceausescu, Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, which took place in 1989, I believe. So I remember at that time, because this was my first exposure to this kind of a controlled overthrow, and I recognized immediately that this was an overthrow because of the way it happened. So this man is giving a public lecture a few days before Christmas. I think it was 21st of December of 1989. He's giving a public lecture, and suddenly a few people in the audience begin to heckle him. Then more join, and the heckling increases and widens until finally they are shouting so loudly in a public broadcast. So now the entire country is watching, maybe a few hundred people heckling him. He asks them to stop. They don't stop. He can't release the police because it is on live TV. So he backs off, goes inside. Subsequently, there is a restlessness, and instantly across all the cities, demonstrations start. This man is caught by a group which is all pre-programmed, and from 21st to 25th, on 25th night, Christmas night, he is shot on public television after a what do they call, a kangaroo court. Just like that, he's declared wrong and shot, killed. And his family, the entire family was shot. Why would you do that? Who did that? Who can organize that in just 4 days? Somebody is overthrown. And I could see the data was all wrong. It's impossible for this to happen spontaneously. Yet the media presents it as a spontaneous public demonstration. No, it was one of the very early such organized regime change operations. But in those days, you didn't have the internet, so it was much more difficult to recognize. The communications were more complex, but still the methodology is exactly the same. And so, understand, there are toolkits, there are specialists, there are funding from NGOs, young student activists, opposition leader controls, catchy single syllable keywords, and then you need the martyrs. Somebody has to die, somebody has to burn themselves, and if they die, all the better, because then it swings public opinion, and that's how the game starts. Observe what's been happening in the last few weeks, even months in India. Observe what happened during the elections, and how immediately after elections, there were these exit polls which were pushing a certain messaging, and then the final actual reading of the polls which were quite different from the exit polls. Observe this. And you'll see the same patterns being orchestrated everywhere. So the goal in going into this kind of depth is, of course, to make you conscious, but also to explain to you that such things do not happen spontaneously overnight with regimes being changed. It's well orchestrated, and the people are in place going back 20 years. Groups have been trained, put in place. It's just a question of activation, and then of trying again and again until you know, and you can force the change. You saw what happened in Sri Lanka, where the public just walked in literally into the presidential palace and the president ran away. Exactly the same patterns. That does not happen just like that. And so you know there was a regime change. By who? Then you see what happens with the person who replaces them. You will get an idea. And this is not the US State Department alone. This is exactly the same framework the USSR used, which today Russia will use, which China will use, and any other institution that wants regime change elsewhere. Some of the European Union groups also, they unite as several countries together to change the regime of Gaddafi. It was this exact same pattern. So I think this is good enough and detailed enough to give you an idea of how this works. We are at the last day practically of the year, and this part of the discussion I think I will close for what it represents. Next time we will look at the Ukraine, specifically regime change, but much more importantly what happened in the war itself, and understand the nature of warfare, because war itself has changed and the causes for the war are different. It was no more about Ukraine or Russia anymore. It was because of something else, and the nature of the conflict in the war, strategy, equipment used, missiles and other technologies used, everything has changed completely. And we'll have to understand that and why the war was allowed to go so long, and why today every step is being taken to end the war. That we will understand, which is much more important for us. And subsequently, my intention is a couple of weeks down to give you a view of the picture, a picture of the future as it's supposed to be, as it is inevitably going to be, based on these data, but it is a positive outcome of the future, which if not now, if not in 5 years, if not in 10 years, it has to happen. And what that positive future is, because of what's possible today. And with all this in between, we can align ourselves to that future and commit to it and take steps towards it. So this is, I think, the most that I want to stay with this part of the discussion. Anything from Alina, Narad, if you want to say anything, if you want to add anything. Some of you have made observations in the comments. I will take them up next time. Please do leave them in. I hope this will help you also to break free from much of the programming, which is the whole intention of this series. To no more be a victim of what happens. And particularly be conscious that every time you're watching something on social media, you click a like or a dislike, it's being used against you. Not that you shouldn't do it, please do. But know that you're being played. And it is done very subtly through the artificial intelligence systems. So in the midst of all this, the message from a spiritual point of view is, the more you live by your instincts, the more you're open to being programmed. The more you disengage from your habit patterns in thought, in emotion, in physical instincts, and particularly the more you get free from your lower emotional passions and live by a higher ideal, which cannot be easily swayed by fear, anger, hatred, or lust, or attraction to finance. The more you will be free from being controlled, the more you will be able to consciously align to the divine will and a higher truth. And by becoming free of this, you become now part of the humanity that breaks free from the old. In the 1960s, the mother said humanity is splitting into two groups. One group that chooses not to evolve and so sinks, and another group that chooses to break away and rises. And increasingly this division is becoming more and more stark. Do not worry about it. Make your choice, work on yourself, free yourself from programming, and start thinking, start observing, start analyzing. Don't take anything or anyone at face value. Do your own research, verify things, and even if something appears as data which contradicts what I'm saying, explore further, and if needed, well, give me the challenge and I will also play with you and learn from you. There's no problem there, although that's not the primary objective here. But this is the only way we can move forward. So there's a lot of positivity to come also, but for the moment we need to understand fully the negative aspects, and next time the aspects of the war, which I have titled for next time the war machine, and we'll see how this machine operates and what its priorities are, which has nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia. It has its own end in itself, its own purpose. So that's it. Let's take a conscious decision to make the necessary effort to free ourselves from all such programming, to become more and more consciously individualized in our deeper and higher centers, and from there opening to either the soul's aspiration within or the higher intuition or light of the divine will, and to live more and more from this deeper and higher center rather than our lesser and instinctive and manipulatable, hackable levels. And let that be for us the focus in the coming year. Because just a few of us being able to make that change will have a massive impact in humanity. May the Divine Mother lead our steps and lead us individually, collectively, nationally, and as a humanity towards our higher spiritual fulfillment. Wishing everybody a fulfilling new year ahead. Namaste.
Namaste. Happy New Year.
Namaste.